Mm, Batman smells, Robin laid an egg. George
Sounds like my
Kittle
kids.
laid an egg. Yeah. All right, everybody. Well, it is Sunday. It is the day after the holiday. Hope everyone had a great holiday or otherwise had a day of some rest, some respite, at least for those of us in the fantasy football world. There's no rest, no respite. Week 16 doesn't mean the same as years past. Week 17 now, the ultimate. We're at the Pent Ultimate, and I've got Chris Allen here to help. And Dr. Gene is going to get us up to date on injury situations around the league. And of course, injury situations aren't necessarily what's swaying lineups as much as COVID situations, Gene. But we don't really have a lot of questions about COVID situations. The big news this morning, of course, Travis Kelce is not going to play. Tyreek Hill is going to play. Let's start with Antonio Gibson, Gene, because he played through his toe injury on Tuesday, didn't practice. There's optimism, but it should be optimism in your lineup this week against Dallas.
Yeah, I don't know. I hope there's some optimism there. Washington really hasn't done too much to, they've got some players there that can back him up a little bit, but J.D. McKissick is on injured reserve now. Gibson is dealing with something that limited him toward the end of Tuesday's game. He didn't have a lot of time to recover before then. This is something that he dealt with last year as well, so he's got some understanding of how to do it. I do think he's likely to play at this point. I wasn't so sure. The local beat writers were not as optimistic on Friday as what the overnight report Saturday to Sunday was. And Gibson did go with the team to Dallas. They've not done a lot with their roster otherwise that I'm aware of. So it looks like he's trending towards playing. But the note we got from Ian Rappaport this morning wasn't particularly optimistic either in terms of, is this a player that's going to be able to go back to his 20 to 25 touches, be effective throughout the game without any setbacks? I don't know that we can go that far, but given the landscape of what's going on today, if he's active, he's hard not to put in your lineup for sure because he's been through this before and he's played pretty effectively through a stress fracture in his leg too. So he knows how to play with pain. He knows how to play with this particular injury. You just hope that he gets enough carries and effective touches to be productive.
So sticking with running backs, Gene, should we have any optimism for Deandre Swift now coming out? I think he was an IR candidate just a couple of weeks ago, and now seeing him getting in some limited practices this week. I mean, should fantasy managers want to stick him in their lineups this week? I know with injuries, with COVID-related situations, they probably might not have a choice. But if you had a choice, where are you at, Dr. Gene?
Yeah, I think if he's active, they're doing it with the intent that they're going to play him. This isn't a conditioning issue with a soft tissue injury necessarily. So you would expect that he's in some sort of condition in order to take a reasonable number of snaps. But I don't think we're going to see Swift take, again, another 15 to 20 carries necessarily. Craig Reynolds looked good last week. Jamal Williams is coming off the COVID list. I don't know that Swift is going to play, though. I still have him listed as likely inactive, mostly because Dan Campbell going into Friday's practice said that he looked good Wednesday and Thursday. We're going to put him through some contact today and see how he does. And then all the beat writers, admittedly, just in the parts of the session that were open to the media, said he didn't really do anything. He was barely taking any handoffs. He didn't really catch any passes. It didn't look like they had him in line to take any contact during that practice. So if that's the case, if that proves to be true, he's probably going to be inactive and it's not going to be a question. If not, and they are comfortable with him taking contact, then you have to decide what his conditioning is like and what you think of Jamal Williams and Craig Reynolds taking snaps there. I don't see a pre-injury usage for Swift right away with just a week of limited practice side. I think the decision is going to be made for you because I'm leaning towards him being inactive, but Craig Reynolds only 1 week, and then and Jamal Williams coming back. I guess you could make an argument that Swift would get 15 touches right away, but hard to make for me.
Yeah, and it's Tim Boyle. So,
Yeah.
Folks, probably breaking ties against DeAndre Swift, but there are definitely people in positions where you might have to play DeAndre Swift, and he might be playing. There are people in situations, Gene, they might have to play Adam Thielen. Do you think that they're going to have the opportunity to today?
Yeah, and I'm okay with Thielen. Thielen said some specific and interesting things where he said he was close last week, but he'd been in situations before where pushing things too quickly cost him multiple weeks on the back end. He didn't want to go through that again. So that tells you that probably what we heard last week that he was close to being able to go and they were just deciding to be cautious was accurate. He said he felt like he was further along in his rehab than most other folks with a similar injury, also a good sign. A full week of limited practice, Adam Schefter is saying he's able to go. I think there's a good chance that, much like some of these other players we've seen taking an extra week to recover, that he comes back and immediately sees a pre-injury usage and workload. I would go so far as to say that he's going to get 10 targets and multiple touchdowns as he has in so many previous games. But I don't think this is going to be a 15 to 20 snap, 2 to 4 target game if he's active, and I think that's likely to be the case. So I temper expectations a little bit, maybe, but if he's active, I don't think I'd have any difficulty at all putting him in your lineup. And again, I would imagine that most of you are hoping that he's active because your other options there are probably not that great at this point.
So with the Patriots running backs, Ramondre Stevenson not expected to play today. Damian Harris now, he's been dealing with some sort of like hamstring knee injury throughout the last like month or so. I know he's going to be the guy. He's likely going to, obviously going to be the starter with Stevenson out. But what should folks expect for Harris? Any chance of an in-game aggravation, anything along those lines, Dr. Gene?
Yeah, he's already aggravated the hamstring once and then missed a little bit of time. So it's definitely possible that we see an in-game issue today. The when you've been doing this long enough, it's pretty easy to see what beat writers are telling you, especially in New England. And the beat writers in New England will tell you what's going on sometimes if they know, without telling you what's going on. And Mike Reese, chief among them, has been saying all week long he does it in a little bit different way every time. This week it was on Wednesday. He was very vocal and upbeat and active in individual drills, and that's essentially telling you he's saying that they're preparing him to play. And then a couple of more limited practices. The Patriots did not elevate anybody off of the practice squad this week, which tells you that not only do they expect Harris to go, but Bolden also as well, because Stevenson isn't going to be there. So I think both of them are likely to go. I think you're going to see pre-injury usage from Harris. You're correct. Hopefully we're far enough outside this window where there's not a huge risk of aggravation, but it will be there. But I wouldn't have any issue putting Harris in a lineup if he's active.
All right. Well, I think actually not that chaotic of an injury Sunday, but I've got to ask you while I got you, Dr. Gene, because we're not going to do a Thursday night show. There's not a Thursday night game this week, actually. Cam Akers, solve for X being X. What happened here?
I think a few things we could think about. One, Akers is arguably the most talented running back and youngest running back, that combination of factors that have gone through an Achilles injury recently. Say what you want about Mikel Leshoure or Cadillac Williams back in the day, or Arian Foster was obviously a very talented back, but by the time that happened to him, he was pretty much a shell of himself already anyway. We're seeing Dunta Foreman, play well through this now. So I wouldn't put him in Cam Akers' pre-injury category necessarily, but he was a talented back as well. So that's something. So we have a player who is at the top of his game, already a talented player, already a big part of what a team wants to do, is going to get a chance to recover well as possible. Surgical procedures change, rehab protocols change. So what had changed 10 years ago to allow some of those players a chance to come back at all was minimally invasive surgery, but it was still a difficult procedure because you kind of have to get the tension right, and you don't really know whether you did or you didn't until afterwards. I think they're learning through that a little bit because these injuries are happening a little bit more often. As time goes on, the rehab protocols change and improve, and we're trying to get folks out of boots sooner, get range of motion back sooner, speed healing, limit scar tissue, what have you. And I think that's happening as well. What Les Snead said this weekend in some of these reports that have come out since Akers has been moved back to the active roster was that Akers rehab went differently for whatever reason. Maybe it was Akers, some of that he put on Akers. He said, I've never seen somebody attack rehab like this. That's probably mostly just front office speak, but it's clear 5 months into this that something is different, right? So was it the surgical procedure? Was it the player? Was it the recovery? It's hard to know. Is this going to be an Adrian Peterson ACL recovery in 5 to 6 months, one off in the future, or is this the beginning of a trend? We just don't know. But it was nice to hear clarification that the Rams really don't have any plans to use Akers during the regular season. They were more or less doing this for Akers to reward him for what he's been able to do and make sure that he gets a year in the pension program, which I think is wonderful. But that doesn't mean he's going to be any sort of contributing factor to any fantasy playoff weeks. Don't expect that. It also doesn't mean that he's going to take 20 carries in the first week of the NFL playoffs either, depending on whether or not they get a bye or not. So I think, that's what the Rams quote unquote vision is to be. But I think for those of you looking forward to 2022, I think this is great news for Akers. He's going to have a full off season to continue to condition and recover, and he is going to be a wonderful test case to find out whether or not a player can successfully recover from Achilles surgery, not only in the first few months but beyond. Dante Foreman, though, is giving us a pretty good indication that it's possible. And again, this is all about running backs. We could list a number of edge rushers and offensive tackles and wide receivers who have effectively recovered from Achilles surgery. The running back position is a different animal for lots of different reasons. From the depth of the position itself and what they're asked to do. So these two players, Foreman and Akers, are really nice indications of this. But it wasn't, it's not impossible. It's just really difficult. And until we see a player do it effectively, it's hard to trust that it's happening. But I think Akers is not going to be a factor for us in the regular season, but see what happens in the offseason and playoffs pretty carefully.
I'd go ahead and I'd toss Marlon Mack on that too, even though he hasn't been used a ton, like by the Colts as well. So yeah, I think that they've been showing us that there's a trend there regarding how the medical techniques have improved over the last year or two. And so yeah, I'm really hopeful to see Akers get back. One more question I had for you, Dr. Gene. I know this isn't going to affect most folks for this week, but Mike Evans, if fantasy managers are able to weather this week's storm and get through to week 17, any chance that they'll see him back in the lineup for Tampa Bay?
I mean, maybe. I think we are at the point now where players with injuries that have a chance of being aggravated are not going to participate much in the rest of the regular season. In teams that are out of it, they're probably going to allow their players to heal. On teams they're looking forward to the playoffs already and they've already clinched a playoff spot, or they're not playing for anything critically important. And I don't know that we're going to put Tampa Bay in that category. I don't know that they've got much chance of a first round bye at this point. I might be wrong about that, but I think that's looking like it's maybe going in a different direction. So I don't think they're going to put Evans out there if he's under any risk of aggravation. The upside with Evans is that he has played through these injuries before and he knows what to do and how to protect himself. So there's a chance, but I wouldn't be counting on it for next week.
And it looks like the same. Well, we'll see about the Saints. Ian Book getting a start, folks. Josh Johnson getting a start. Just before I send you out the door, Doc, thank you as always for your expertise and all of the great insight. And it is times they are changing with those Achilles injuries and running backs. A few other players for next week, just to give folks a preview, because again, if you're a subscriber, you get all of Dr. Gene's thoughts as part of the injury round. It's a great reason. It's worth this subscription alone. Doc, you could go off on your own and probably, make a franchise out of that. Thankfully, we get you, football guys. All the subscribers get you. For next week, just a quick thumbs up, thumbs down, or, a percentage chance that we're going to see them next week, okay? Lamar Jackson.
I don't like the way this bone bruise is going, honestly. I would have expected him to do a little bit this week. Hopefully this is a situation where they knew he wasn't going to be ready. Let's not do anything in practice. Let's prepare for following week. So 50-50 at best.
Darren Waller.
I have no idea what's going on with Darren Waller. I don't know if anybody knows what's going on with Darren Waller. We're going to find out.
Darren Waller, that's about it, yeah.
Well, other than to say this, there's either something very important going on with his back that they elected to take care of because they knew that the IT ban was going to limit him a little bit. So let's just go ahead and take care of the back issue. Just purely speculation. Or there's something else going on with the knee than the IT ban. And that didn't really make a ton of sense to begin with anyway. Again, as we said over and over, it's not really a structural issue necessarily. That injury had the look of an MCL sprain at some point too. So all I think I can say with certainty with Waller is that something doesn't add up, and we're going to find out why later. So no, until you see him anywhere near the practice field, you would expect him to not be able to go.
But every week, Dr. Gene's able to go on our behalf. And aren't we so lucky? And it's great to see you every Sunday morning and most Thursday nights and even on Tuesdays, even though you're not physically there with us. You're there with us now, Doc. I hope you have a great Sunday.
I do too. And whoever is doing those Tuesday mashups with my face on whatever else it's appreciated. Thank you. I get a chuckle out of those every week.
It's great.
There's some new ones lately too. So, who is doing that, by the way? Do we know?
Brian Sumner. Sumner.
Okay. All right. Well, I definitely know who to reach out to then. Okay.
Taking the baton from Five-ish. Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, good luck to all of you. Well, yes. Yeah, those things. Well, whatever. Yeah, for sure. That's a hard conversation sometimes in the middle of an office session. Oh, hey, by the way, is that you? Yeah, that's me.
Wolverine, loving you.
Bye.
Bye. It's wonderful. Our community's awesome. Our chat room's awesome. And we want to try to return the favor, Chris, and answer some of these unanswerables. And again, before I get into some specifics from the chat room, I've been answering some questions while we've been asking Dr. Gene questions. So I have an idea of what's on folks' mind. And the biggest thing, of course, is Travis Kelce. All right.
Yeah.
Travis Kelce last week was a golden ticket. If you had Travis Kelce, you probably got through to the next round. And now you're going to have to get to the next round without him. I compared this to when Patrick Mahomes went out during that Cleveland playoff game last year. Chris, you need that Chad Henne scramble. You need somebody to make that Chad Henne scramble for you so that you can survive and maybe meet back up with Travis Kelce. Let's hope. Next week. Okay. So first, I'm gonna give you. It goes without saying, by the way. I think Dalton Schultz at this point is back in our circle of trust. It wavered for a little bit. It's Washington. I think he's back in the circle of trust. I'm gonna give you three more that I think are in the circle of trust, in the order I have them, and then you can comment on these guys. And I'm obviously there's a lot of players, Kyle Pitts, etc. Like there are players where obviously Mike Gesicki, Dallas Goedert. These guys are all obviously in your lineup. But here's the next. Here's the next three. Okay.
All right.
And these are all players that I think were available on waivers this week and may still be available on waivers right now if you're listening. Number one, Jared Cook.
Yes.
And when Mike Williams went out, and we'll talk a little more about that, that's a cinch. Number one, Jared Cook against the Texans. Number two, Albert Okwuegbunam.
Yes.
And the key here is Drew Lock being reunited with his college quarterback, and he sure does force the ball to him, especially in the red zone. That's number two. And Okwuegbunam is also quite an athletic wonder playing the Raiders. Number three, in your neck of the woods there, CJ Uzomah. 3 for 91 and 2 touchdowns first time around against Baltimore. And I hope that Zach Taylor, Brian Callahan understand this isn't a Joe Mixon game. This is a Joe Burrow game. So stick with Joe, but the other Joe. Would you agree that those are your preferred, if you're going to the waiver wire to get your Kelce replacement, those are their preferred guys?
Yes, absolutely. And those would be, I think, in order, the guys in terms of not just targets, but also touchdown equity. I mean, those are the players that I would be looking at in that order for sure.
Okay, so I'm just going to toss out some names and we're going to react. All right.
Right.
Cole Kmet gets to catch passes from Nick Foles.
We've been doing this Cole Kmet thing like all season, haven't we? And expecting him to have one of those good games. And I guess, yes, given the matchup, given the fact that, I mean, who else outside of maybe Darnell Mooney should we expect to catch passes? I mean, even though David Montgomery has been used quite frequently out of the backfield. So I think that Kmet is fine from a process standpoint, because we can't really see some of those targets going too many other places. But but we've been expecting that for a while now. Allen Robinson has now missed how many games? It's been like at least 2 games now in a row, and we haven't seen Kmet do much of anything. And the matchups have been there for him. So I get it from that standpoint, but I'm not expecting too much.
I agree. And I look, in Allen Robinson's case, and I'm not saying this to besmirch Robinson's character. I mean, he's a high character, a good dude. But I can just imagine him getting that positive COVID test and being like, oh, no, I can't play because of COVID. Oh, man.
Such a bummer.
What a bummer. He's not going to play this week. He's not off the COVID list. Okay, off of the COVID list this week. Facing the Vikings, Tyler Higbee.
Love it. I think that entire matchup, I think he's the one that sits more on the outside than anything else, because let's say from a Galaxy Brain standpoint, those targets that Ben Skowronek were getting, maybe those could have gone to Higbee, just from where they were caught, the area, like the interior part of the field, shorter ADOT targets Skowronek was getting last week. Let's say those go to Higbee. Higbee does a little bit more for at least after the catch, and then that's where Higbee can wind up making his day. But that's me projecting as to what they did last week onto what they would do this week. But I think overall, looking at the entirety of the Rams passing attack, I mean, from Kupp to OBJ to Van Jefferson, I mean, there's just so much else there, so many other options for Matthew Stafford, that it becomes hard for me to think of Higbee being at least having a high upside play, but at the very least, maybe a few targets, 30, 40 yards. Honestly, that has to be like probably his floor, but that could also be a ceiling at the same time. Yeah,
he hasn't come through. Higbee's another one kind of like Kmet in the sense that we've been waiting waiting, and hasn't come through. Okay, what about a semi-obvious choice and one that, I mean, he got a start and he was great. Then he got another start and he wasn't good. Then he got another start and he was good. Are we in or are we out doing the Foster Moreau hokey pokey today?
I think I'm with all the other guys that we've already kind of gone through, and most of them should be available on folks' waiver wire. I would rather take those guys. Like, I would rather take a shot on CJ Uzoma at this point in this season. I would rather take a shot on Albert O at this point in the season. I think either one of those two guys provide, at the very least, similar target share with, to me at least, more perceived upside in terms of their matchup, in terms of their touchdown equity, where they're used at, like on the field once either of their teams get into the red zone. I think I would just rather go with those guys than trying to wait for Derek Carr to help me get to help me get to a championship and moving those pieces like down the field. I just can't do it anymore.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay, I'm just going to throw a whole bunch of other names because there are probably some folks who are scrambling. Maybe, you were hoping for your day after Christmas miracle and Kelsey was going to play, or your waiver wire is just that thin. Maybe some folks out there, and I love this, by the way. I love it when I hear that people say, I was going to pick up this player and my opponent this week picked them up instead. So I can't play Jared Cook. I can't play CJ Uzoma. Yes, using your waiver wire to play defense, that's also a thing. I did it with Tyler Huntley, even though he ended up on the COVID list. So I'm just going to throw out a whole bunch of names, and you can tell me if you had to pick one or two of them, which ones, all right? James O'Shaughnessy against the Jets. Brevin Jordan against the Chargers. Zach Gentry, and as a Steelers fan, I got to throw him out there. Zach Gentry against Kansas City. Evan Ingram, remember him, with Jake Fromm against Philadelphia. Ricky Seals-Jones on the Dallas-Washington game. Tyler Conklin, remember him, against the Rams. And Gerald Everett against Chicago. O'Shaughnessy, Jordan, Gentry, Ingram, Ricky Seals-Jones, Tyler Conklin, Gerald Everett. Who's the most likely to give you that Chad Henne scramble to keep you alive?
Okay, so it might sound weird, but I think Evan Ingram provides at least some sense of, the volatility that you might want, like, out of some of those guys that are there. Because we saw with Jake Fromm, like, he was willing to push it downfield quite a bit. Like, Kenny Galladay was even starting to get kind of hot, like, once Fromm got under center. So it looks gross. Totally understand, like, why folks wouldn't want to play anybody associated with the Giants at this point in the season. But if you are looking for that type of play that could wind up, Evan Ingram could be that guy that catches that 20-yard pass that winds up getting him into the end zone. I mean, that's entirely within his range of outcomes. And so, like, he'd be that guy that winds up in, like, the Millie Maker, like on DraftKings or something like that. So I think that's where I'm at with Evan Ingram, where it's like I have to squint to see it, but I can still kind of see them him getting there out of that group. So I think he'd be the one to do it for me.
Yeah, well, you still have talent there, and like you said, there's just a sort of YOLO thing for Jake Fromm. I mean, you're in there, man. Like, give it a go. Yeah. Philadelphia's pass defense has been pretty suspect this year at times. Remember, they had that streak of giving up 80+% completion rates. So I like that one. And Evan Ingram's still a pretty talented guy. So we'll see what happens. Maybe there's a little glimmer there. Kenny Galladay is a desperation play. We're going to have a lot of desperation plays, desperate people out there. Desperation in the playoffs. This is quite a thing. But again, I want to take it aside. And I know this, I mean, in some ways, I'm not being honest and realistic if I don't acknowledge this sucks. I mean, this sucks for fantasy football people out there everywhere, including us. We've had to work more, but that's okay. We're lucky to get to do this work and serve y'all. But it sucks because it's just like if we watch any sport, Chris, any final in any playoffs, we want to see the best versions of these teams going against each other to decide who's really the superior team.
Yes. Yeah.
However, there is an aspect of the NFL more than any other league, although the NBA was like this last year. NHL is like it to an extent too, where it's an attrition war. Yeah, you have to survive, and you have like the Chad Henne scramble. You have to get by on that day with what you got. And lots of teams have won Super Bowls having to rely on players they never, ever intended to rely on. Just wish it didn't have to be this way. On that note, there's a lot of players that we never would have contemplated playing in week 16 because of COVID list. So let's step through some of these situations, okay? And some of it's injuries too, which does happen every single year. And I'm looking through the questions and getting an idea of the players that are the toughest calls. Okay,
Mhm.
with Mike Williams going on the COVID list, how bullish are we, and Jalen Guyton? How bullish are we on Josh Palmer? How much do we stick our neck out and play him over players that otherwise we might have expected to rely on? Like, I don't know, a DJ Moore type, for instance, a Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf. How far are we willing to go with Josh Palmer today?
I would put him square in the like mid-range, like wide receiver 2 conversation. Like just not just from the amount of targets that we should expect him to get, but also how we've seen him used in the past. Like what was it when they played against? Was it against? No, it shouldn't have been against Houston. It was against maybe 2 weeks ago when I believe Keenan Allen was out on the COVID list, and then we saw Josh Palmer just kind of slide into that role there in the slot. Also wound up with a touchdown. I believe he also ran a few more routes than Jalen Guyton, but it was Jalen Guyton that got that deep shot from Justin Herbert, which on that ridiculous throw, like from Herbert as well. So it's like consistently from a role change perspective, Palmer has been the one to pick up that slot role. And even if Keenan Allen is still going to be active in this game, I would still assume him to run some of those shorter routes, also work the interior part of the field. And with the matchup that they're playing against the Texans today, it should be one of those, let's just get in, let's just get out. They don't have to force the ball down the field if they don't want to, just because the Texans secondary, they should be able to roll over and get through them without too much of an issue. So yeah, I'm very bullish on Joshua Palmer today. Like just if Herbert's still the one going to be under center, he's going to be the one that's going to be able to catch some of those targets intended for, let's say, even for Austin Eckler, since Eckler is going to be out as well. So I think all of the roads kind of point towards Palmer being the guy to take over a lot of that opportunity. So yeah, I'm very bullish on him today.
Yeah, you're getting Justin Herbert in your lineup when you get Palmer in at one of his top 3 targets against the Texans. There were some questions I was just looking in the chat room, Chris, like Palmer or Mooney, Palmer or Devontae Smith. That's instant. I don't even have to pause and think about that. So that should give you an idea where we're at. I think wide receiver 2, and wide receiver 2 is not an easy pedestal level tier to get to this year. The wide receiver's been pretty rough this year. Some weeks I put together my wide receiver rankings, Chris, and I get to wide receiver 25 or so, and I say wide receiver 25 and wide receiver 50 aren't that different. So Palmer being above that line, that's pretty meaningful. Staying with the Chargers, and I mean this when I say this, I have not had a question where I have not answered Justin Jackson. If Justin Jackson's in the question, Justin Jackson's one of the answers. I mean, I don't know where I have him now. Running back 8, running back 7, something like that. I mean, obviously you're not playing him over, I don't know. See, the funny thing is, like, this is what my brain does to me, Chris. I'm like, oh, obviously you're not playing him over Alvin Kamara. Well, maybe you are playing over Alvin Kamara. That's kind of where we are with him at this point.
No, and I agree with that. I was trying to think of any of the other just like star running backs at this point. Or guys
Taylor already played.
Yeah, like Ezekiel Elliott. I mean,
I'm taking him over Zeke.
Exactly. And I think like you hear the names and you're almost like, oh yeah, top 12 running back, but oh, wait a minute. Yeah, I would rather play Justin Jackson for the most part, other than the running backs that have already played so far, like the Jonathan Taylors, the Nick Chubbs. I mean, those guys I would still put ahead of Justin Jackson, but there are very few other guys that I would rather play like over him at this point.
And look, he's fragile. Okay. Justin Jackson could get hurt on the 3rd play and your whole season could go down the drain thinking, why did I trust Justin Jackson? But the opportunity that's there for him as the clear lead running back of this offense, because Joshua Kelly fumbled at the 1 last week and was part of the reason they lost. Larry Roundtree will get some run, but this is Justin Jackson's big chance. Similarly, and I guess we can compare these two, although I think it's still Justin Jackson, and maybe there's a little less risk of injury with Ronald Jones, but it is the Tampa Bay offense, and man, he looked fresh last week. He looked like he was chin of the bit, ready to get at it. How aggressive are we with Ronald Jones this week against Carolina?
I'd still say you should be pretty aggressive with Ronald Jones as well. What was it? The last time he played against Carolina, he had like close to 100 yards and a touch as well. So he was productive against them in their last meeting. And I get the narratives that some folks are going to want to have against Ronald Jones, and that once he whiffs on that first pass block and gets Brady sacked, he might be the one to ride the pine for the rest of the game. But what are the other options, to be quite honest? I mean, are we going to assume that Keyshawn Vaughn is going to come in and take over for Ronald Jones for 3/4 of the game? Me personally, I can't see it. So while there are some issues with Ronald Jones outside of him being a runner, I mean, his pass catching chops really haven't been there for however many seasons we've expected that to be a thing for him. So while I think just from a pure running standpoint, he should be the one to get most of the opportunity, we can't really expect a ton for him outside of that. Even still, against Carolina's defense, also with the dwindling number of options that Tampa Bay is going to have today, I think we should still remain bullish on Ronald Jones. I mean, even Brashad Perriman didn't even clear COVID protocols, so
Right.
they're not even going to have him today either. So I do think outside of it's just Gronk, it's Antonio Brown,
yeah.
and it's Ronald Jones. I mean, that's
Yeah.
really what Tom Brady has to work with today. So we should expect him to at least acknowledge that and to be able to lean on those weapons for this week on.
Yeah, I would say this is a Ronald Jones week. I mean, this is a week that I wouldn't be surprised if he gets 25 carries. And with Ronald Jones, he can always break that 80-yard touchdown run for you and make the week. So, you know, if you're coming down to and let me give you and let's take over on the scale here. And again, I know this is near and dear to your heart, so it might be difficult. On one side of the scale, Justin Jackson, Ronald Jones, players that you haven't trusted all year in your lineup. You didn't expect to trust all year in your lineup. On the other side of the scale, Joe Mixon, who you have trusted all year, but in this moment of truth, if someone was saying Ronald Jones or Justin Jackson on one side of the scale, Joe Mixon on the other, where are we going?
I would go more towards the Justin Jackson, like Ronald Jones side of it. That's where I'm at. I do think that it's the concern I have. Well, one is the ankle injury that Mixon had last week. Even though he was still in the game on the final play of the game, he was still out there on the field. So that's not a concern. Full practice throughout the week. So the injury is not as much of a concern for me, but just overall seeing Samaje Perine starting to mix in a bit more on passing downs than I would like to see. We're all assuming that Justin Jackson and Ronald Jones should get the majority of that work for their respective teams. So I think from an opportunity standpoint, they've already got Joe Mixon beat. And if we're already talking about this game for the Bengals as one that they're going to have to win through the air, I think that it winds up being easier for me to start Justin Jackson or Ronald Jones like over Joe Mixon today.
Yeah, I agree. I see in my crystal ball for Joe Mixon like 60 or 70 total yards, maybe a touchdown, maybe 3 touchdowns. I mean, that's the thing, but probably not. In Baltimore, the strength of their defense has been the run defense at this point. So again, rational coaching, sometimes it really is a bummer to assume it and not get it, but rational coaching says, let's go back to last year when Joe Burrow would throw the ball 45 times a game. That's how you get the division lead. And just by the way, on the other side of that scale, also, these kinds of running backs that we've been talking about, is there any pause or hesitation? Javonte Williams, you're excited to get him in the lineup. Melvin Gordon's been doing some good things. I think we've already established Justin Jackson, Ronald Jones over Joe Mixon. Would you dare go to a Denver committee running back over Joe Mixon today with Denver playing Vegas?
No, I don't think I'd go that far. Because I think at the very least, like from a touchdown standpoint, we at least know that once they get into the red zone, it's more than likely going to be Joe Mixon that's still out there on the field. For Denver, it's difficult to say that once they get into the red zone, it's going to be Javonte Williams or it's going to be Melvin Gordon. So I think that becomes a bit harder, or it's a tougher sell for me to say, yep, go ahead and throw in Javonte Williams, because from a rushing standpoint, he should be fine. From a pass catching standpoint, he should also be fine. And then also he'll have the touchdown equity as well. I can't really say that. Where with Joe Mixon, you can make that argument that he should see the majority of the rushes, still should be someone involved in the passing game, even though, like I was saying earlier, Samaje Perine has been taking over some more targets over the past few weeks. But then once they get into the red zone, I mean, again, we should expect to see Joe Mixon out there on the field. So I think it's easier for me to go with Joe Mixon just from that standpoint alone. Javonte Williams, Melvin Gordon, unless we can assume either one of them are going to wind up breaking off a long one, which is complete within the range of outcomes, especially for Javonte. Other than that, I can't really see it for either of them. So it's tougher for me to recommend them over Joe Mixon, or even a guy like, let's say well, I guess Najee Harris is a bit different, though, because while he'll have the opportunity.
Don't ask me about Najee Harris this week, please.
Yeah, it's like, especially after last week, it could go the same way as last week. He could get all the touches and still only have about 40 yards from scrimmage. So it doesn't even matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, some of these are very difficult because you mentioned Najee Harris, and when a running back's going to get 90+% of the snaps and touches for an offense that has their starting quarterback in, so it's a viable offense. We're not talking about Ian Book at quarterback. We're not talking about, we'll talk about Josh Johnson. That might actually not be so bad. It's so hard to say bench Najee Harris. And this is one of those ones where I almost have to say you're on your own, Because if it was me, on one hand, I would feel very inclined. I might even be benching Najee Harris for Miles Sanders this week. We haven't talked about the Philly running backs yet. We haven't talked about Alexander Madison yet, right? And almost all of these, when I think about the range of outcomes, I just feel like that range of outcome ceiling is so low for Harris because of how the Chiefs defense has been playing and because the Steelers offense is not that difficult to solve right now. But how can you put a running back in week 16 on your bench who's going to get 90+% of the snaps and touches in a viable offense? It's not easy. These are not easy calls. Just real quick to touch on it. So, overall temperature check, since I mentioned him, on Miles Sanders, who I believe barely practiced this week, but didn't have an injury designation.
Yeah, that's weird. Yeah, I would say lukewarm just because of the fact that he didn't practice, like just what you just laid out.
Right.
No practice, no injury designation, which makes zero sense to me. Actually, we should have asked Dr. Gene about him.
Yeah, I didn't think about that one.
Yeah, but from an opportunity standpoint, I think he should be able to, from an opportunity standpoint, he should be the guy that we should flock to, especially given their matchup like today, and yet another good matchup for them as he had last week. So I think lukewarm, just because we don't know how many touches he's actually going to get today. But other than that, I think he should be a fine play.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's the Giants with Jake Fromm. I mean, I think even Jordan Howard, if you have to go with a Hail Mary at running back, someone who might be on your waiver wire right now, Jordan Howard could easily get to 18, 20 touches and a touchdown, get to close things out. All right. Josh Johnson and the Baltimore offense, right? I mean, I think you're obviously keeping Mark Andrews in. Marquise Brown is the big question here. I have a league this morning I'm looking at Marquise Brown, and I'm looking at actually Braxton Berrios. There's a good Hail Mary for you, by the way. Yeah. And I'm looking at Jordan Howard. So number one, Marquise Brown. Are we running away? Are we standing tight? Does it depend? It's tip the scales one way or the other. Tough call. And then what about Josh Johnson? Because like for folks that were depending on Tyler Huntley, is it just as simple as, well, if you were depending on Tyler Huntley, just go with Josh Johnson because we know the ceiling is there, at least as a runner. We saw him get in cold off the bench for the Jets and put up numbers.
Yep.
Or there are choices out there. Some of the choices I've been seeing, Chris, are like Tua Tagovailoa against New Orleans tomorrow night. Ben Roethlisberger against Kansas City, Matt Ryan against Detroit. These are some of the other choices that are out there. So we got this whole Josh Johnson situation, how it affects Marquise Brown, and whether Josh Johnson is someone that maybe you might think about going with the season on the line.
Yeah, and I think the question comes down to how are they going to wind up like deploying their offense, and where I think with Josh Johnson, we saw him with the Jets. When he essentially came in there for Mike White, it was just can we get the ball out of his hands quickly enough to some of the guys in the short area of the field? Because they were just like peppering the running backs with targets, peppering the wide receivers, like the slot wide receivers, like just right out of the gate, and just get the ball into your playmakers' hands and let them do the work afterwards. So if they take that same type of approach with Josh Johnson, then of course, like Mark Andrews, no problems there. But with Marquise Brown, can they wind up manufacturing those same types of touches for Marquise Brown? Well, that's where I say hold tight with him, because I can see a scenario where they kind of move him closer to the line, or move him closer to the formation, give him one of those drag routes, 5 yards out, like across the field, put it in his hands and let him do the work afterwards. And they could probably wind up doing most of that, especially given like Cincinnati's pass rush is kind of weak. Their man coverage isn't as great. I mean, especially with the number of injuries that they've had over the past few weeks. So there's a scenario where both of them, both Mark Andrews and Marquise Brown, can make enough plays for Josh Johnson to be viable. I think it's possible. I mean, given how he played earlier this season for the Jets, and also where Cincinnati's defense currently stands at. So it sounds bad. It might look weird, but I think it's definitely possible for any of the two, and by the two I mean Mark Andrews and Marquise Brown, to have good fantasy days. Like, given the way that I think that with the assumption of rational coaching, Baltimore's team is one of the better ones, like in terms of employing that type of logic with their game plan. So I do think that there's at least enough there for either Marquise Brown, Mark Andrews to have like at least productive fantasy days. Maybe not the same like what Mark Andrews just had like this past week against Green Bay, but I mean, I think that there's enough there for him.
Yeah, the bottom line there, when you look back, is that in a couple of years, we're going to be talking about Tyler Huntley as a fantasy football starter, an NFL starter.
Oh yeah,
And
I
there's
hope
a
so.
lot good for him. I mean, one of the things my wife said this, and it's great to have this positive take on all of these players getting opportunities because of injuries, because of COVID, and may they make the most of their opportunities. As it's still one of the last true outposts of the American dream. If you work hard enough, if you're good enough, you can really make it big, is in the NFL. And I think we've seen that for Tyler Huntley, and we've seen that for Craig Reynolds. And maybe see it for more players over the next few weeks as it's getting rough out there. And by the way, just to go back and touch on something I meant to add to the conversation about the Denver running backs, Javonte Williams, Melvin Gordon, for folks that are weighing it out there, it's Drew Lock. So the Broncos offense could still just be a smoking crater today and take everybody with it because it's Drew Lock. Now, Drew Lock could also surprise us and put himself back in the conversation. What else can we touch on? And as I've been doing this more recently, trying to touch on the players that affect the most people out there in your questions. And then I'm answering questions in the chat room. One player we haven't touched on, and I guess the fact we haven't touched on him means, well, geez, there may not be a lot of running backs we would start over Saquon Barkley this week, Chris. Yeah, or do you want to give some folks a pat on the back and some encouragement if they feel like, I can't set my line without Saquon Barkley? It's Saquon Barkley.
But at this point, does he still have that same name value in order for you to try and break ties and favor him at this point? Again, we're talking about Jake Fromm under center. I mean, I know that's at the very least that doesn't inspire a ton of confidence. What we're down, Sterling Shepard isn't playing. Kadarius Toney isn't playing.
No, Toney's going to play. They say
he is going to play.
But
okay,
I mean,
I heard he was more on the doubtful side, but if he's going to play, okay, fine.
It is trended more positively as the game, but does it matter? Not really.
And I think that's the problem. Like, if none of the rest, if the rest of the offensive situation for the Giants doesn't inspire a ton of confidence, then why should we have any confidence in Barkley? It's not like there's going to be a continued number of targets going his way. What is this touch like? Is there any sort of touchdown opportunity in store for him? I think there's a lot of other running backs that are currently out there that could see, not a lot, but there are other options, I think, for most folks out there that can put you in a better situation than Barkley at this point. And with the Giants' entire offensive situation being nothing that we really want to try and, I guess, continue to invest in as of right now, it's too difficult for me to say that, you should definitely try and make space for Barkley in your lineup at this point. I'd rather go in a different direction.
At some point, you have to look at this, and I think where we stub our toe a lot on these decisions, not just during the playoffs, but especially in playoffs, but during the regular season, is when we're betting on a trend to reverse. We talk ourselves into those bets, and I'm talking to myself when I say this, but it happens so infrequently that the trend just gives you the inflection point reverse. It has to be a lot of things that come together. And I don't know if you have any of those things going in Saquon Barkley's favor, but watch him bust a 75-yard touchdown run. If he does that on your behalf today and you were smart enough to do it, well, that's why we play fantasy football. So it's always your call if you made it this far. One last parting shot before we send everyone on our way, and hopefully we all meet back up next week in our fantasy football finals. Chris, do you have any players that are puzzling you? Well, first of all, actually, any weather situations, anything where we might put a pebble or take a pebble off or on the scale because of a weather situation today?
I was taking a look at it earlier yesterday, and then this morning. There's expected to be some snow in the Seattle area, throughout today's game. It looks like just some light snow, if I'm reading the forecast correctly. No wind, like 10, 12 mile per hour winds, so I'm not concerned about that. The snow, I'm not concerned about too much either. Now, there's a chance for players like slipping or having a ball tip out of their hands or something like that, like a chaotic event that we really can't prognosticate before time anyway. So overall, it might look gross, but for any of the players that you had expected to play today, so like if you're going into this matchup thinking, hey, I'm going to start Russell Wilson, Tyler Lockett's back, so I'm going to go ahead and throw him in my lineup, DK Metcalf. I mean, all the plays that you would typically play in this game, I would still say go ahead and break ties in favor for those players. Now, unless you've got better options, obviously go ahead and start those. But from a weather perspective, there's nothing that I'm seeing as of right now that would make me think that this game is going to be significantly impacted by the elements. So overall, I think the slate should be clean.
But the most important thing, Chris, is on Christmas Eve, I got to build a snowman and get in a snowball fight.
Yeah.
So that made, because I've been living in Texas and New Orleans since 1997. So that was fun. That was pretty special. Anybody that is confounding you, let's turn the tables and say, you don't have to present the question, but just as you're setting your lineups this morning, because I gave you one of mine, like, am I going to leave Marquise Brown in, or am I going to pivot to Braxton Berrios, or maybe even Jordan Howard? We're all in the same boat together in the sense of having these tough decisions. Any decision that is confounding you this morning?
Josh Allen. That's the one that's confounding me at this point. I get it. Stephon Diggs, I think he had one good game against the Patriots. I think that was last season, but that was in the Week 16 matchup that they had against them, where I think the Patriots were essentially waving the white flag on their season at that point. So no Cole Beasley, no Gabe Davis. Okay, so now Isaiah McKenzie. Okay, fine. Good gadget player. Devin Singletary, also not just involved as their lead rusher, but also involved in the passing game. So I see parts and pieces there. Dawson Knox, obviously, as well. But just, can they move the ball enough for Josh Allen to be a top 12 fantasy option this week? Unless we're assuming also that he's going to have, 15 design runs for him this week, so he makes some of his production that way. Against the Patriots defense, it's tough for me to not look at him in my lineup and say that Matt Ryan is a safer option for this week against Detroit. So why not? Why can't I just get the same type? I could probably get the same type of production from Matt Ryan. So it's just, I don't know. I think I'm kind of stuck on if Josh Allen really is a top 12 quarterback option this week.
And I think that you lay it out well, because look, it's fantasy football, and anybody and everybody, like, the answer is Josh Allen, right? Like, play Josh Allen. However, if you think of it like chess, Chris, if you're playing chess against Bill Belichick and you already take like a bishop and a knight off the board before the game starts, Belichick's probably going to be able to checkmate you, right? Belichick's going to be able to outmaneuver you, knowing going into this game, you can't establish the run. You don't have a credible running game. And your short-range target of Beasley and one of your boundary targets of Gabriel Davis are both out. Belichick might be able to outmaneuver you. And if Josh Allen has one of those frustrating days, and it may come down to Mac Jones and Damian Harris, it may come down to how much they can put together long drives, shorten the game, and give the Bills a deficit to have to make up. And that's when Josh Allen starts to press. When Josh Allen's behind and it's a difficult day for him, that's when his decision-making starts to falter. That's when he tries to do what Patrick Mahomes was doing earlier this year and score 21 points on every play, as someone put it. So in hindsight, if Josh Allen is a dud, a landmine, then we should not be surprised. And that's where you're kind of on your own. Your rankings might say this, your cheat sheets might say this, history might say this, but you're the manager, you're the GM. It's like you're making the play call on the 2-point conversion to win the game, and the percentages might say this or that, but the play is going to turn out how it turns out, and we only find out after the moment of truth, after the point of no return. So I like that you picked that one because it's not obvious, but I think, again, if you're still here on week 16, if you're still listening to this show, if you're still joining us, well, some of it might be because we're so handsome and you enjoy our company and our mellifluous voices, but it's probably because you know your stuff in fantasy football, you're a football enthusiast, and you should trust your gut and enjoy this. And hopefully we continue to enjoy this holiday weekend, enjoy time with friends, with family, with loved ones, with our beloved professional football, and the picture will become clearer, at least who's going to be in the finals of our fantasy football leagues as we march on to the playoffs. Lots of exciting, intriguing action. We love tracking it all with you folks because you're so very classy.